eradicate extreme poverty and hunger,
achieve universal primary education,
promote gender equality and empower women,
reduce child mortality,
improve maternal health,
combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases,
ensure environmental sustainability,
develop a global partnership for development.
In a workshop format, we thought we'll do a panel discussion on these issues, especially for benefit of young potential journalists, like most of you here who are being trained in institutions here to become future journalists. So we thought it would be a good opportunity for you to get some ideas and some perspectives from people from the region, from South Asia, who have been involved in development communication work for many years. So we'll be having a panel discussion soon. This is the first part of what we hope will be a 5-phase process of taking the MDG message to the grassroots communities in South Asia. Now to do that, we need to train people in these grassroots communities to produce contents for the media. MDGs, or the Millennium Development Goals, are really targeted at raising the living standards of these people. And there are very good goals and targets set in this process. The targets are to be achieved by 2015. These Millennium Development Goals were adopted by world leaders at the UN in 2000. So there was a 15-year period given to achieve these goals or targets. So we are right at the midway mark or the midlife of this process. In many South Asian countries, with the possible exception of Sri Lanka and Maldives, these targets may not be reached unless the message is taken to the grassroots, where the people themselves could get involved, get more involved in the process of achieving these targets. So that's why we at AMIC proposed to the UN Millennium Campaign that rather than targeting the mainstream media in the cities, where much of it, even if it's publicly government-owned or privately owned, so we have developed 2 curriculums. One is for training of journalists who are mainly print journalists. The other is for training of, I would call them content producers for community radio, because it's not necessarily radio journalists, but program producers we are looking at training. Now to do that, what we felt was we cannot do that by inviting people to a seminar in Delhi, Dhaka, Kathmandu or Karachi, and presenting to them information and ideas in the English language. What we need to do is train them in their own language, within their own communities. So in this first phase of this process, what we have done is we have developed a curriculum which is in English. It's a draft curriculum, and we also assembled a number of resource material which could be used with the delivery of the curriculum, with examples of stories and various program ideas from the region, which could be shared with others.
A lot of treaties, a lot of declarations which have been signed, but basically nothing was happening at the ground level. So Kofi Annan, who was the then Secretary General of United Nations, he actually converted the Decadal Summit, which was supposed to happen in mid-2000, and converted into a Millennium Summit. So, and he called all the heads of the states to actually think through the entire process, that what is required to be fulfilled by them for the citizens of their own country, the minimum development goals. So he brought together the developed as well as developing countries, and with the aim that probably we will have a strong collaboration between these two segments, and plus definitely these heads of the state will come out with a possible solution. So these 189 states, which is now 192, they came together and they chalked out 8 minimum development goals, which were later called Millennium Development Goal, of course, because it was a Millennium Summit. So they chalked out that. They set up 22 very clear indicators, which is now, of course, 52 indicators, and plus they set a deadline, which is 2015. So the government decided on this, the government of various nations, and they set a deadline for themselves. So it's not the United Nations, it's basically the government of their own country, and it's there. So thinking that probably this declaration also should be another kind of declaration, for the export purpose. Basically the government go back to their own countries and relax and have a nice time. So Kofi Annan at that time constituted United Nations Millennium Campaign, basically with the objective to hold the government to account, to give the voice to the voiceless, so that we can always tell the government that, come on, you have promised all these things for the citizens of your own country, and you need to realize this by 2015. So that's the entire mandate, because the entire thing is that government should honor the promises that they have made. And at the same time, the citizens of the country, it's their responsibility also to remind government the promises that they have made. So that's what UNMC is doing, and so we work very closely with media, we work very closely with parliamentarians, with civil society organizations, to work at the grassroots level so that this entire movement comes from them. We work with youth and we work with the faith-based organization as well. So, because the assumption is that if these government can fight war, they can definitely fight poverty. If millions and billions of dollars can be spent to bail out an economy, then definitely we can bail out a person living below the poverty line as well. And we have enough resources. What is required is the vision will of the government to actually undertake that. So that's the entire assumption. The limitations with this declaration is that this is not enforceable. So what if the government doesn't do it? It means simple. You cannot actually enforce the entire thing. So the voice of the people is the major enforcing factor. If we have the voices of the people, because ultimately, unfortunately or fortunately, politics is still ruled by muscle, money, or masses. So we can't do anything about muscle and money, but we are just trying to actually do a movement within the masses so that they all stand up and take action and remind the government. So media is a very critical factor, within the entire campaign, because not only it can multiply the messages, but also it can give voice to the voiceless.
How can I write a story? Because the story is there. Everything is there. The quotes are there. The statistics are there. It's very well put together. But these are done by people. But it's a feature.
When you're talking about grassroots journalism, it's very important to include the government media officers also, who are journalists as well as source of information. Advertising, as you rightly said, is brand building, is telling a story in 30 seconds, telling a story in 1 minute. What you might take hours to read or minutes to read, if it is effective promo, is effective TVC, it can make all the difference. So advertising, PR are very interdependent, and they are very important part of mass communication. But in advertising, PR, both of you really, and you talked about the new media, the blogging, the SMS and all. So one has to think of various kinds of media in which MDGs can be promoted. But MDGs not as MDG per se. It may have no relevance. You have to really localize them. You have to make them relevant. There has to be proximity to make it happen. And I'm sure it's not just the mainstream media we should bother about. If you look at the statistics, I can tell you about India, it looks all pervasive. Print reaches 19.9%. TV reaches about 49%. Radio reaches less than 20%, cinema reaches only 3%, and internet only 1.4% as of now in the first round of IRS in 2008. So one has to be little innovative. The stories are at the village level, the problems are at the village level. It's very important for us to look beyond the mainstream media and look at folk media, look at interpersonal media to bring about difference. In India, not even the right information, it is being used very well by the journalists. I think journalists are using more than anybody else. If we can activate the communities at that level, it will make all the difference. I'm quite positive about it.
A couple of decades in Nepal, which is a very good test bed in a way of government communication. Now, with the arrival of the term MDGs in 2000, has it changed in any way how you look at development communication and communicating the development?
In Nepal, we have experienced so many media, grassroots media exercises. Like we can say it began from wall newspapers. Just like calendars, we have a lot of wall newspapers in the villages, the school rooms, school classes, clubs, and many organizations produce their own wall newspaper, stays in the walls, and the change or edit every month or some every week. And there are community audio towers like loudspeakers put on the roof of the house or on a pole, and they also created awareness regarding, because we have a lot of illiteracy. At that time when I started journalism, it was about 20% literate in Nepal. Now it is not over 50, less than 50. Now when the issues of MDGs came, I think it is not a new thing for me personally, because we have been doing this, dealing with these issues for a long time. In the beginning we said the basic needs of the people, food security, education, health, all these things were included in those days also in development communication or development reporting. Now these have come in the name of MDG, more elaborate, more categorized way. We started grassroots media, but we had journalists in the centers in Kathmandu or in cities, but we needed grassroots journalists. So for that we did barefoot journalism training. Like barefoot doctors in China, we trained journalists in villages. They were not professional journalists, they were not so educated, only those who can read, write, literate people. They were given skills of news, identifying the news, collecting the news, reporting, and a little bit of interviewing and press laws. With this 1 week training, we produced about 700 barefoot journalists all over Nepal. Now they are working as grassroots reporters for so many radio stations, community radio stations, and some are now working in television and in mainstream media also. So they are the basic points, starting points, I think, which will be very useful for us, that how to start grassroots media we can share our experience.
When the term development communication came around in the 60s and 70s, it was more or less conducted in a fashion where urban people like us used to decide what these development issues are, what the people really need to know, produce radio programs and broadcast into these communities. But now there's this participatory communication process where we say, I think the MDG campaign itself believes that the people's perspectives, the people's voices should be reflected, and the media should be facilitate or carry out these messages to policymakers and the community at large. Maybe Melinda, I will ask you, because you are involved with the Asian Media Forum. How can you get these people's voices to the policymakers and the community? Do you really need the journalists to do it, or can you do it also through other means?
I was invited by one university to do a one-day media sensitization program for about 50 lecturers from different colleges from that university. And one of the questions with which I began my presentation was that how many of them have heard the word MDG? And let me tell you that only 2 hands went up, and they only knew the word Millennium Development Goal. So I think we have to think about this particular aspect also, that we have not been able to reach to the people. Of course, media is to be blamed for that, because media, mainstream media particularly, has not taken interest in all these matters and all these subjects. And mainstream media is basically interested, and its interest in glamour, glitz, negative stories is increasing over the years, and they are completely overlooking the.
And journalists as well as media organizations are doing in their capacities to cover development. The main problem to me seems that it's the issue of capacity to cover the development news. And yes, commercialism is there, politics is there. What journalists lack is training, orientation, access to proper resources. That's all included in the capacity of a journalist to cover the development news. And just to give you one example, that we hear and we read a lot of news that minister for that ministry inaugurated that number of schools in a far-flung place, but the headline becomes that my party will change fate of this country. Basically, it's a development news that this is taking us a step closer to MDGs. That's what we as the journalists need to be told, how to get the development potential of the journalism out of the politicized and commercialized news.
If you look at the way that it actually functions in each country, it is very much in alignment with the national development goals of each country. So for instance, the UN works in India through the national development goals. It works with the relevant line ministries, and the national development, the common minimum program of the government of India is far more superior to the Millennium Development Goals, because their targets and what they want to achieve is much higher than what the goals set out themselves. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that this is not something that is being imposed from the outside. It is something which the governments themselves have agreed to, and what are the goals that they have created for themselves, for their own country. So to make it more relevant, we have to look at the issues which are facing people. Look at it in that sense. Let's forget about the jargon and all that, and let's look at the human voices, the human aspect of the goals. What is it? What are we trying to achieve here? It's about basic rights, entitlements that everybody has to have.
Now, I think it is important to remember that we are talking about the MDGs and not drop the MDGs altogether. We may not call it the Millennium Development Goals in whichever language we're speaking, but for me, the most powerful concept behind the Millennium Development Goals is not that it was the UN that came up with this idea. It was 189 heads of state and government who signed on a declaration. It was the UN played a facilitating role in bringing them together, but the Millennium Declaration is a piece of paper which was signed by 189 world leaders, and it actually lays out, it's not a blueprint. What it lays out is what hinders development. It's quite honest in the assessment of why we have not achieved development goals which we've been setting ourselves for the past 60 years, both at national level and at international levels. It demonstrates, at least on paper, a political will to make a change, to make development happen. I mean, we come from South Asian countries where we've been talking about this issue. All leaders get elected, if there are elections, on the plank of development, that they will bring about change, and yet we don't deliver on national goals, national commitments. But in 2000, world leaders went to New York and signed up on a Millennium Declaration, which actually did say why we are not achieving development and how we will go about achieving and what we will achieve, but not saying how each country should go about doing it. Now, if you are going to talk to district level reporters to make that link between what was said in New York in 2000 and localizing it and bringing that sort of connection home to the reporter who's reporting at the district level or the block level about why people in that area are not getting clean water, Girls are not going to school, there are no toilets in schools. Roads are not built and women don't get to the hospital so that they can have a safe delivery. Why mothers die giving birth to children, the most natural thing in the world, and yet we have the highest number of maternal deaths here. Why children die before they reach the age of 1, 5 or whatever. And why we are depleting the environment and not looking at natural resources. Now they put it all down on paper, they signed it, but did they come back home and tell us that they signed it? No. In the first few years after the MDGs were agreed, there was very little discussion about these goals and the commitment made by political leaders in our media. It's only in the past 3 or 4 years that we are listening to them talk about it and we are hearing the media raise these issues. Now, it's happening at the national level, is it happening at the local level? I think what the Millennium Campaign is trying to do to take these issues to media at the district level is highly commendable, and as trainers you have a really big challenge ahead of you, but it's not a difficult challenge. I found that media, when they we move beyond the jargon, they relate to these issues more easily if they work at the local level than if they work in national papers. And yes, what Kalinga mentioned, that linking it to economic, political, cultural issues is very critical, and it's seldom mainstreamed in all the stories that happen in the media. What I didn't get from Kalinga's presentation is how exactly you propose to structure this training program. I mean, everything that Kalinga said makes sense, it's very important, but you need to look at a structure that will make sense to a journalist who's coming to your training workshop. And it's fine to give an introduction about the 8 MDGs, which everybody is familiar with, maybe not in quite the same language that the UN talks about it, so your role is to translate that into the local language. But I think it's even more critical to look at developing curriculum or sessions around the issues that hamper the achievement of these goals. Issues like governance, I mean, Kalinga touched on corruption. Now, I think it's important to look at how right to information is a tool that is there for most journalists to use, but is not used often enough. Most of our countries have good laws in place, but how are we using that as journalists to uncover, look at issues? How journalists are actually relating global events to the local issues, as Kalinga mentioned, the issue of an IMF structured loan and the commitments made by the Sri Lankan government and the impact it has on farmer suicides. Similarly, the WTO negotiations that happen somewhere in Geneva or Doha or Hong Kong, and how it affects our farmers, and how a local journalist can actually access that information and use it and relate it to a story about a farmer suicide. So looking at international cooperation as an issue, but also helping the journalist accessing information about such. Kalinga is in a privileged position. He could access the IMF agreement that Sri Lanka government had made. But how many local journalists, A, have access to this information, and if they do they have the ability to analyze it and put it in the local context?